Heather's fingers tighten around the ID. With one swift motion, she rips it in half. The sound of tearing plastic cuts through the airport like a gunshot. For a moment, the world seems to stop. Jasmine stares, frozen, as the shredded pieces of her ID flutter onto the counter. Her breath catches in her throat. A dull roar builds in her ears. Shock, rage, humiliation, crashing over her all at once. Heather smirks. Now, do you have any real identification? The words are a slap, loud enough that a few people in line glance over. Someone gasps. A woman mutters, "Oh, hell no." Jasmine's hands curl into fists at her sides, nails pressing into her palms. Her voice, when she speaks, is low but lethal. "Scan my ticket." Heather scoffs. There's no need. This, she gestures at the torn ID, was fake. End of discussion. Jasmine exhales sharply, her jaw clenched so tight it aches. "Call your manager." Heather falters just for a second. Jasmine steps forward, locking eyes with her. "Call your manager, now." Heather's smirk finally fades as she realizes this isn't going away quietly. But before we dive deeper into this unbelievable story, let me know in the comments, where are you watching from? And if you love stories that expose injustice and turn the tables, don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss a new one. Jasmine Carter strode through the bustling terminal of Dallas-Fort Worth International Airport. The hum of conversation, rolling suitcases, and distant flight announcements blending into a familiar symphony of travel. At 20 years old, she carried herself with a quiet confidence, her caramel-brown skin glowing under the soft fluorescent lights. Today was important, not just because she was flying first class to New York City, but because this was her first solo trip. Her first real step into proving to herself, and maybe even to the world, that she was capable of standing on her own. She had packed everything meticulously, triple-checked her itinerary, and made sure her ID was tucked safely into the front pocket of her sleek carry-on. There was an undeniable thrill in the air, a sense of adventure she hadn't felt in a long time. As she maneuvered through the terminal, her father's words echoed in her mind. "You're more than my daughter. You're strong on your own." She had grown up hearing those words, but today they felt different. They weren't just reassurance anymore. They were a challenge, a call to step into her own power. Jasmine wasn't just any traveler. She was the daughter of David Carter, CEO of Carter Airlines, a company that had become a beacon of black excellence in an industry that had historically kept people who looked like her in the margins. Her grandfather, a man who had faced countless barriers, had built Carter Airlines from the ground up, and her father had expanded its legacy with a relentless drive for progress. She admired them both, but she didn't want her identity to be tied solely to them. She wanted to carve her own path, to be recognized not for the weight of her last name, but for the strength of her own merit. She had never been one to seek special treatment, and she wasn't about to start now. As she passed through the terminal, she caught glimpses of other travelers, businessmen hurrying toward their gates, families juggling strollers and backpacks, a group of teenage girls snapping selfies in front of the giant flight display. Everyone had somewhere to be, stories of their own unfolding in this transitory space, and Jasmine was just another passenger among them. That's how she wanted it. No privilege, no assumptions, just a young woman heading to a new city, ready to take on the world. Her grip tightened slightly on the handle of her carry-on as she approached the check-in counter. There was a flicker of nerves in her stomach, but she pushed it aside. This was supposed to be easy, a routine flight, a simple process. She was prepared for a smooth journey. What she wasn't prepared for was the moment everything would come crashing down around her, when the simple act of proving her identity would turn into something far more insidious, when the name she carried, so full of history, strength, and success, would become the very thing used against her. She had no idea that in just a few minutes a stranger's assumptions would test not just her patience, but her dignity. Jasmine approaches the check-in counter, gripping her passport and ID tightly, feeling the smooth plastic edges pressing into her fingertips. The airport is alive with motion. Families weave through the crowd, dragging rolling suitcases behind them. Businessmen in crisp suits murmur into Bluetooth earpieces. Flight attendants stride purposefully through the terminal. Nearby, a toddler squeals with delight as he chases a rolling toy across the polished tile floor. His mother calling after him. Overhead, a voice crackles through the speakers, announcing a final boarding call for a flight to Miami. The scent of fresh coffee and fast food lingers in the air, mingling with the faint whiff of jet fuel. Jasmine breathes it all in. The energy, the movement, the sense of possibility. She has always loved airports. To her, they represent freedom. People coming and going, lives intertwining for brief moments before dispersing again. She has spent countless hours in terminals just like this one, watching her father conduct business, listening to him negotiate deals with investors, watching her mother speak at diversity and inclusion panels for the airline industry. But today, for the first time, she isn't here as the daughter of David Carter, CEO of Carter Airlines. She isn't just a passenger flying under the family name. Today, she is simply Jasmine, a young woman taking control of her own life. Her heart thrums with excitement as she approaches the counter, ready to check in for her first-class flight to New York City. She has dreamed about this moment for weeks, walking through the airport, completely independent, without her father's name opening doors for her, proving to herself that she belongs here just as much as anyone else. She tugs her suitcase closer, smoothing the fabric of her tailored travel outfit, a soft lavender blazer over a simple white top and well-fitted jeans. Her curls are pinned up in a neat bun. Her makeup is subtle yet polished, and her nails are painted in a glossy nude shade. She looks composed, professional, like any other young business traveler. She steps forward to the counter, feeling the cool air from the terminal vents brush against her skin. The check-in agent, a blonde woman in her early 40s with sharp blue eyes and a stiff smile, barely glances up before holding out a hand. Jasmine slides her passport and ID across the counter, offering a polite, "Good morning." The agent, whose name tag reads Heather Collins, takes the ID with a practiced efficiency, typing quickly into the system. But then something changes. Her fingers pause, hovering above the keyboard. Her eyes flick down to the ID, then up to Jasmine. The movement is subtle, but Jasmine catches it immediately. That brief hesitation, the way Heather's gaze lingers on her face, scrutinizing her features as if searching for something that doesn't belong. Jasmine feels a shift in the air, a tiny prickle at the back of her neck, like an unspoken question hanging between them. She has seen that look before, that barely concealed doubt, the kind that makes her skin feel too tight, like she suddenly has to prove herself in a space where she should already belong. But she pushes the thought aside. Maybe she's imagining it. Maybe Heather is just having a long day, dealing with difficult passengers. Heather's expression remains unreadable as she holds up Jasmine's ID, tilting it slightly under the bright airport lights. "What's your final destination today?" Her voice is even, but there's something clipped about it, something just a little too cool. Jasmine keeps her smile in place. "New York City, Flight 218, first class." Heather's brow lifts slightly, almost imperceptibly. "First class," she repeats, as if confirming it for herself. Jasmine nods, ignoring the slight edge in Heather's tone. She doesn't want to assume anything. She has spent her whole life walking the fine line between awareness and exhaustion, aware of the way people sometimes second-guess her, exhausted from constantly having to prove them wrong. But not today. Today is about her independence, her freedom. Heather looks back at the ID, lips pressing into a thin line. She holds it up once more, angling it toward the light. Something about her demeanor shifts, not just scrutiny, but suspicion. The moment stretches longer than it should, and Jasmine feels her patience start to fray at the edges. "Is there a problem?" she asks, keeping her tone light but firm. Heather exhales sharply, setting the ID down flat on the counter. "This doesn't look quite right," she says, her voice taking on a sharpness that wasn't there before. Jasmine's stomach clenches. "Excuse me?" Heather taps a manicured nail against the ID. The laminate, the photo placement, it's off. This doesn't look like an authentic driver's license. A cold wave of disbelief crashes over Jasmine, momentarily stealing her breath. She blinks, trying to process what she just heard. "What?" Heather's expression hardens, her blue eyes sharp with certainty. "I've seen a lot of fake IDs in my time. This one isn't real." Jasmine's pulse spikes, heat rushing to her face. Her fingers curl around the handle of her suitcase, gripping it tightly. "That's my real ID," she says, forcing her voice to stay calm, steady. Heather's smile is tight, condescending. "Sure it is." Jasmine hears a few murmurs from people in line behind her, the weight of curious eyes pressing against her back. Her hands tremble slightly, not with fear, but with anger. Anger at how quickly she has been dismissed, how effortlessly she has been judged. She swallows hard, trying to steady herself. "You can scan it," she says, voice firmer now. "You can verify it through the system." Heather doesn't move. Her fingers remain on the ID, her gaze locked on to Jasmine's face, as if trying to decipher some hidden truth. Then, in a single swift motion, she grips the ID firmly between her fingers and rips it in half. The sound of tearing plastic is unnaturally loud, cutting through the hum of the airport like a gunshot. For a moment, the world seems to freeze. Jasmine stares in disbelief as the two halves of her ID flutter onto the counter, jagged edges stark against the smooth surface. Her breath catches in her throat. The humiliation, the shock, the sheer audacity of what just happened slams into her like a freight train. She feels her heartbeat in her ears, the blood rushing to her head. Heather sets her hands on the counter, tilting her chin slightly. "Now," she says coolly, "do you have any real identification?" Heather Collins forces a polite smile as another passenger steps away from the counter, but the tension in her jaw betrays her growing frustration. It's been a miserable day, one of those shifts where everything seems to drag, where every interaction feels like an unnecessary obstacle between her and the moment she can finally clock out. The flight schedules have been a mess, delays stacking up like a cruel joke, and passengers have been more irritable than usual. A man earlier had nearly thrown a tantrum over a minor seat reassignment. Another woman complained about baggage fees as if Heather personally made the airline's policies. She's exhausted, her patience razor thin, and the last thing she needs is another entitled passenger making her job harder. She straightens her posture and adjusts the silk scarf knotted neatly around her neck, a part of her uniform she usually takes pride in. But today, even the crispness of her attire feels like a burden. Her feet ache in her low-heeled pumps, and her perfectly coiled blonde bun is starting to give her a headache. She glances at the time on the screen, still hours left in her shift. Suppressing a sigh, she turns her attention back to the next person in line. Then she sees the young woman step forward. The moment Heather lays eyes on her, something inside her shifts. Something subtle, instinctual, something she doesn't fully acknowledge but is already coloring her perception. The girl is young, probably college-aged, with smooth brown skin and sharp, intelligent eyes. Her outfit is polished, her posture poised, but it's the name on the ID that makes Heather's brows lift slightly. Carter. She feels her stomach tighten just a little. That name, it's familiar. Too familiar. She's heard it before, seen it printed on airport signs, on the news, in business reports. Carter Airlines. One of the biggest black-owned airlines in the country, led by David Carter, a man whose presence in the aviation industry has always been, in Heather's opinion, loud. His speeches about diversity and inclusion, about breaking barriers, it all sounds great in theory, but Heather has never been able to shake the feeling that people like him are given too much credit, that companies like his are propped up more by political correctness than by real merit. And now here's this girl standing in front of her with that last name, looking calm, entitled, like she belongs in first class without question. Something about it rubs Heather the wrong way. She barely looks at the ID as she takes it, but the name lingers in her mind, a thorn pressing deeper the longer she thinks about it. She types into the system, wanting something to be off. Maybe a minor inconsistency, something that would justify a second glance, a bit of skepticism. It would be satisfying in a way, proving that not everyone with a recognizable last name gets to coast through life unchecked. But there's nothing wrong with the booking. Still, that doesn't stop the nagging feeling in Heather's chest. She glances at the ID again, scrutinizing the details. The laminate catches the light strangely, and the photo alignment seems just a fraction off. It's enough for her to latch onto. enough to fuel the doubt she's already convinced is justified. "This doesn't look right," she mutters, mostly to herself but loud enough for Jasmine to hear. Jasmine's head tilts slightly, her expression shifting into something unreadable. "Excuse me?" Heather lifts the ID again, turning it over between her fingers. She's seen fake IDs before, mostly from cocky teenagers trying to sneak into airport lounges or upgrade their tickets to first class without paying. And sure, this one is from an official source, but something about it feels off. Or maybe it's just the girl standing in front of her. "You said first class?" Heather asks, her voice just a little too sharp. Jasmine nods, her jaw tightening slightly. "Yes, I'm booked in first class." Heather doesn't like the way she says it, like it's obvious, like it's expected. There's no nervousness, no hesitation, just quiet confidence. Heather glances at the screen again, sees that everything matches, but something inside her refuses to let it go. She doesn't know why, but she just knows there's something off here. So she makes a decision. Before she can question it, before she can second-guess the impulse, her fingers tighten around the ID. With one quick motion, she rips it in half. Jasmine watches Heather with growing confusion, the check-in counter suddenly feeling colder, the space between them tightening with tension. Heather's fingers hover over the torn ID, her smirk barely concealed beneath a layer of false professionalism. Jasmine's heart skips, a slow burn of disbelief creeping up her spine. Did she just hear that right? The words feel too absurd to be real, too brazen to be anything but an awful joke. "I'm sorry, what did you just say?" she asks, her voice steady despite the way her pulse hammers in her ears. Heather doesn't hesitate. "This is fake," she repeats, lifting her chin, her expression set in quiet amusement. "It's not even a good one." Jasmine feels something shift inside her, something cold and sharp. She blinks, forcing herself to process what's happening, but the sheer audacity of it leaves her momentarily stunned. She glances down at the pieces of her ID, split clean in half, lying there like discarded trash on the counter. Her fingers curl into fists at her sides, nails pressing into her palms as she exhales slowly through her nose. "That's my real ID," she says, the words clipped, controlled. Heather tilts her head, the smirk never leaving her lips. "People try this all the time. Nice try, sweetheart." The condescension in her voice, the casual way she dismisses Jasmine's existence, sends a fresh wave of anger through her. Jasmine feels her body stiffen, her breathing shallow. This isn't just a mistake. This isn't just an overworked employee having a bad day. This is something else. Jasmine straightens, planting her feet firmly. "If you think my ID is fake, then scan it. Check the system," she says, her voice no longer as polite. Heather exhales sharply, shaking her head. "I don't need to. It's obvious." "Obvious?" Jasmine repeats, disbelief dripping from the single word. Heather leans in slightly, lowering her voice as if imparting some great wisdom. "A young girl, first class, last name Carter. You know how many people come through here claiming to be someone they're not?" Jasmine stiffens. The accusation hangs in the air like thick smoke, suffocating, undeniable. She can see it in Heather's eyes, hear it in her voice. Heather doesn't believe she belongs here. Not in first class, not in this airport, not with that last name. The realization settles over Jasmine like a lead weight, but she doesn't let it pull her down. Instead, she squares her shoulders, her voice steel-edged. "You're wrong." Heather sighs, glancing at the growing line behind Jasmine. People are watching now, subtle but present, whispers, shifting feet, the sharp glances exchanged between strangers. A black woman 3 places down frowns, crossing her arms, while an older white man behind Jasmine awkwardly adjusts his tie, looking anywhere but at them. Jasmine sees all of it, feels all of it. The scrutiny, the judgment, the unspoken assumptions. She's been here before, in different ways, in different places, but never like this. Never with her ID, her proof of existence, lying in pieces before her. Her hands tremble, but her voice does not. "Call your manager," she demands. Heather's smirk falters for the first time. "Oh, come on," she scoffs. "We both know how this ends. You don't have another ID, you can't board, move along before I have to call security." Jasmine laughs, but there's no humor in it. The sound is sharp, cutting. "Oh, you should definitely call security. I'd love for them to see this." Heather's jaw tightens, and for the first time, uncertainty flickers across her face. She looks past Jasmine, scanning the line, realizing that people are paying attention, that the murmurs are growing louder, that the woman 3 places down now has her phone out, recording. Jasmine sees the shift, sees the flicker of doubt in Heather's expression, but it's not enough. Not yet. Heather's hand twitches at her side, her fingers tightening around the counter as if gripping for control. "Miss Carter, I don't have time for this," she says, her voice quieter but no less dismissive. Jasmine takes a step closer, her voice steady, unwavering. "Neither do I." The sound of tearing plastic slices through the air, sharp and unnatural, turning heads like a gunshot in a silent room. For a second, everything around Jasmine seems to pause. The chatter of travelers, the rolling of suitcase wheels, the distant announcements over the intercom. It all fades into a ringing void as she stares at the jagged remains of her ID, the pieces fluttering lifelessly onto the counter like discarded scraps of paper. A rush of heat floods her chest, followed by an icy wave of disbelief. Her mouth parts, but no words come out at first. She can't process it, can't grasp that this woman, a complete stranger with no authority beyond this counter, just destroyed her identification. This isn't just an inconvenience. This isn't just an overstep. This is personal. This is a violation. "You just destroyed my real ID!" The words tear out of her, voice trembling but sharp as a blade. Heather doesn't flinch. If anything, she looks satisfied. She crosses her arms, one brow lifting with a smirk that turns Jasmine's stomach. "People like you think you can fake your way into places you don't belong," she says, slow and deliberate, her tone coated in something thick and ugly. Jasmine feels the words like a slap, each syllable a weight pressing against her ribs. The air around her shifts, no longer just heavy with tension, but charged with something far worse. A new kind of silence settles. Not the peaceful kind, but the expectant, waiting kind, the kind that means people are watching. The murmurs start immediately, hushed but unmistakable. Someone gasps. A few people shift uncomfortably. Others lean in slightly, sensing something bigger than a simple check-in dispute. A sharp click. Someone is recording. Jasmine sees the glint of a phone lens just past the counter, a woman in a red coat holding it steady, her expression unreadable. A black man a few feet away shakes his head, his arms folded across his chest, watching like he's seen this scene play out before. The older white businessman in line behind Jasmine clears his throat awkwardly, looking away, pretending not to notice. Jasmine's hands clench into fists. The weight of every moment she's ever been doubted, questioned, dismissed, or underestimated crashes over her at once, but this time, there's no way in hell she's letting it slide. She plants her feet, breath coming fast and uneven, but her voice is steel. "You're going to fix this," she says, slow and sharp. "Right now." Heather scoffs. "Oh, please, do you even have another form of ID, or are we done playing pretend?" Jasmine sees red. "Check the system. Scan my ticket. Call your manager." "Do your job." Heather shrugs, her confidence unwavering, as if she's done nothing more than toss out a bad receipt. "I don't need to check anything. Your little act is over. I suggest you step aside before I call security." Jasmine steps forward instead, called them. Heather's smirk falters just slightly, just enough for Jasmine to catch it. It's the first crack in her armor. Because Heather expected compliance, submission, humiliation. But Jasmine isn't playing by those rules. "I want your manager," Jasmine says again, louder this time, her voice carrying, making sure that everyone within earshot knows that this isn't ending quietly. The businessman behind Jasmine adjusts his tie, his gaze flickering between her and Heather, then quickly away, as if not seeing it means he doesn't have to be involved. His fingers drum anxiously against the handle of his leather briefcase, his discomfort radiating off him in waves. He's seen enough in life to know that something about this situation isn't right, but not enough courage stirs in him to speak up. Silence is safer, silence is easier. A few feet away, a black woman in a sleek gray blazer gasps audibly, her expression shifting from shock to something sharper, something angry. Her arms cross over her chest as she steps slightly forward, not directly intervening yet, but watching, listening, waiting. Heather, oblivious to the shifting energy around her, waves a dismissive hand toward Jasmine. "You need to leave. I've got real passengers to check in." Jasmine feels the words hit like she's been erased in front of everyone, as if her presence is an inconvenience, something to be brushed aside. Her jaw tightens, her breath sharp and controlled. "Call your ma—" A deep voice cuts through the tension. What's going on here? A security guard strides toward them, his dark blue uniform crisp, his belt weighed down with radio equipment. His name tag reads M. Reynolds, and from the way he carries himself, it's clear he's done this dance before, stepping into tense situations, diffusing them, deciding who gets heard and who gets ignored. Heather turns to him immediately, relief flickering across her face. "Officer, thank you. I was just handling an issue. This young woman presented a fake ID, and when I confiscated it, she became aggressive." Jasmine almost laughs. The sheer boldness of the lie, the way Heather twists reality with such casual ease, nearly knocks the breath from her. "Aggressive?" she repeats, her voice a dangerous edge. "You destroyed my ID in front of everyone." Reynolds looks between them, his lips pressing into a thin line. His eyes flick down to the torn pieces of the ID still on the counter, then back to Jasmine. His posture stiffens slightly. "Ma'am, do you have any other form of identification?" Jasmine's fingers tighten around her phone. "Scan my ticket. Check the system. I'm booked in first class under Carter Airlines." Reynolds hesitates. The name Carter does something, places a small crease between his brows, a flicker of recognition, but before he can respond, the black woman in the blazer steps forward. "Excuse me," she says, her voice crisp, slicing through the air like a blade. "I saw the whole thing." She handed over a valid ID, and this woman ripped it up without even scanning it. Heather's head snaps toward her, irritation flashing in her eyes. "Ma'am, this doesn't concern you." "It does now," the woman fires back, "because I don't like watching people get treated like this." A few others in line shift uncomfortably, but the murmurs are growing, the quiet outrage bubbling to the surface. A younger man near the back has his phone raised, recording everything, and Heather finally notices. Her jaw tightens. Reynolds exhales, adjusting his radio. "Okay, let's de-escalate this," he says. His tone is neutral, but Jasmine hears what isn't being said. "Let's calm this down before it gets worse." Before it gets louder, but Jasmine is done shrinking. She steps forward, standing taller. "No, let's escalate it, because I want to know why this woman thought she had the right to destroy my ID before checking anything." Heather visibly tenses. The control she thought she had is slipping. The businessman behind Jasmine finally speaks. His voice is quiet but firm. "She's right. This doesn't seem fair." Heather spins toward Reynolds, desperate now. "Look, I was doing my job. If I questioned it, I had a right to." "Your job is to verify, not to destroy," Jasmine interrupts. "And now I'm demanding you get your manager out here, or should I be calling corporate myself?" Heather's face drains of color. She knows what that means. And for the first time since this started, she looks genuinely afraid. Jasmine's breath comes fast and shallow, her chest rising and falling with the force of her emotions. Humiliation, rage, disbelief. They crash over her like a storm, each one striking harder than the last. She can still hear the snap of her ID being torn, still see the smug satisfaction on Heather's face, as if it were some kind of game. Her fingers tremble, but she forces them into tight fists, planting her feet firmly on the tile floor. She refuses to back down. "I want your manager," she says, her voice tight but unwavering. Heather smirks like she's been expecting this, like it's amusing to her that Jasmine thinks she has any real power in this situation. "I am the authority here," she replies, her voice dripping with false confidence. Jasmine lets out a sharp breath, shaking her head. "Then get someone higher." Heather's eyes flicker for half a second, hesitation, the first sign that she might be losing control of this situation. But she quickly recovers, straightening her shoulders, her expression sharpening into something even colder. "There's no one higher you need to speak to," she says, waving a dismissive hand like Jasmine is nothing more than an inconvenience. "You don't have a valid ID, you're not flying today, end of discussion." The heat in Jasmine's chest explodes into full-blown fury. "End of discussion," she repeats, her voice louder now, carrying over the murmurs of the watching crowd. "You think you get to decide that? You think you can just rip up my property and tell me I don't belong here?" Heather lifts her chin, clearly not expecting Jasmine to push back this hard. "I don't make the rules," she says smoothly, a picture of forced composure. "If you can't prove your identity, you can't fly. I don't know what else to tell you." Jasmine laughs, a hollow, incredulous sound that holds no humor. "You don't know what else to tell me? How about, let me check the system? How about, I made a mistake?" She gestures at the computer screen in front of them, her voice rising. "You can verify me, but you won't, because you decided the second you saw me that I wasn't supposed to be here." Heather's smirk falters for a brief moment before she hardens again. "I don't need to verify a fake ID." Jasmine feels her entire body tense at those words, her nails digging into her palms. She can see the way the people around them are reacting now. Some uncomfortable, some outraged, some pulling out their phones, recording every second of this. "You're going to regret this," Jasmine says, her voice quieter now but somehow even more powerful. Heather shrugs. "Not my problem." Jasmine leans in slightly, eyes locking onto Heather's. "Oh, it will be." A firm voice cuts through the growing commotion. "Ma'am, is there a problem here?" Jasmine turns her head to see two uniformed airport security officers approaching, their expressions neutral but watchful. The growing crowd has drawn their attention, and now the situation is no longer just between her and Heather. Heather steps forward, her confidence returning the moment she sees the officers. "Yes, there is a problem," she says smoothly, flicking her gaze toward Jasmine with a look of pure authority. "This passenger presented a fake ID and is now refusing to leave the counter. I followed protocol, but she's becoming disruptive." Jasmine's mouth falls open slightly, a stunned laugh almost escaping. "Disruptive? You?" She exhales sharply, reining in the anger bubbling inside her. "You tore up my real ID and now you're lying to cover it up?" One of the officers, a tall man with a neatly trimmed beard, lifts a hand to calm her. "Let's just take a step back and figure out what's going on here," he says, measured but firm. But before anyone else can speak, another voice joins the conversation. "What's going on?" Jasmine turns again, her heart pounding. A man in a dark navy suit, crisp and professional, strides toward them, his ID badge clipped to his jacket. He has a no-nonsense air about him, his gaze sharp and assessing. His name tag reads, "Mr. Reynolds, Airport Manager." The moment Heather sees him, she stiffens slightly, but she covers it quickly, straightening as if she's completely in control. "Mr. Reynolds," she greets smoothly, already shifting her tone into one of practiced authority. "This young woman presented a fake ID. I followed protocol and confiscated it." Jasmine snaps her head toward Heather, anger pulsing so hot it feels like it might ignite. "You ripped it in half. That's not protocol." Mr. Reynolds' gaze flicks downward. His brow furrows slightly as he notices the torn ID pieces on the counter. His expression darkens. "You physically destroyed a passenger's identification?" Heather hesitates just a fraction of a second, but Jasmine sees it. "The ID was fraudulent," Heather insists. "It was poorly laminated. The photo wasn't aligned properly. I've seen enough fakes to know one when I see it." Jasmine's chest tightens, frustration clawing at her. "That ID was real. You didn't check the system. You didn't scan it. You just decided I didn't belong." The weight of those words hangs in the air. Mr. Reynolds' expression hardens as he exhales through his nose. "Did you attempt to verify her information before you—" His eyes shift to the counter, lips pressing into a thin line. "Did this—" Heather's confidence falters, but she recovers quickly. "I made a judgment call." A dangerous silence follows. Mr. Reynolds looks at her for a long moment before turning back to Jasmine. "Do you have any other form of identification?" Jasmine, still shaking, reaches into her bag, pulling out her university ID and a digital copy of her driver's license on her phone. She holds them out. "This is me. You can check my name against the passenger list and you'll see I have a first-class ticket under Jasmine Carter. The same last name as Carter Airlines." She sees it then, the moment it clicks for Mr. Reynolds. His head jerks slightly, recognition flashing across his face. He types something into the computer, his eyes scanning the screen before they widen slightly. Heather notices the shift and immediately pales. "Wait," she says, voice suddenly weaker. Mr. Reynolds looks up, his expression unreadable, but the tension in the air is undeniable. "Miss Carter," he says carefully, looking back at Jasmine. "Are you related to David Carter?" Jasmine lifts her chin, forcing herself to stay composed. "He's my father." Heather visibly stiffens. The security officers exchange glances. The crowd murmurs louder now, realization rippling through them. A businessman in the back lets out a low whistle. A woman whispers to her companion, "Oh, she really messed up." Mr. Reynolds slowly turns back to Heather. "You made a judgment call on David Carter's daughter?" His voice is level, but there's something dangerous beneath it. Heather's face drains of color. Her lips part slightly, but for the first time, she has no words. Mr. Reynolds' fingers move swiftly over the keyboard, his posture rigid as he enters Jasmine's name into the system. The screen flickers, processing for a few seconds before pulling up the full reservation details. His gaze locks onto the passenger profile and his jaw tightens. First class, paid ticket, priority status, frequent flyer under the Carter Airlines executive family account. The name Jasmine Carter is highlighted in bold, and next to it, a note confirming VIP handling instructions. A beat of silence stretches between them as his eyes flicker between the screen and the torn remains of her ID on the counter. He slowly lifts his head, his expression shifting from irritation to realization. He looks at Jasmine first, as if truly seeing her for the first time, and then his gaze snaps to Heather. Heather, who is still standing there, her arms folded tightly over her chest, trying to mask the panic creeping into her features, she notices his stare and immediately stiffens. "What?" she asks, her voice quieter now but defensive. Mr. Reynolds doesn't answer right away. He exhales sharply through his nose, his fingers curling against the counter. "Heather," he says evenly, his voice carrying a weight that makes the air between them grow thick. Heather swallows. "What?" she repeats, but there's a tremor in her voice this time. "You made a judgment call, did you?" His tone is no longer neutral. Heather blinks rapidly, shifting her weight from one foot to the other. Yes, I thought." "You thought?" Mr. Reynolds repeats slowly, tilting his head. "You thought a passenger in our system, with a fully verified booking, a confirmed first-class seat, and a VIP status under the Carter Airlines family account, was a fraud?" Heather's face goes completely pale. A murmur ripples through the crowd, more phones lifted, people now fully engaged in the unfolding disaster. Jasmine stands rigid, her nails pressing into her palms, her breath shallow but steady. Mr. Reynolds straightens, folding his arms over his chest. "Did you even attempt to verify her before tearing up her ID?" Heather opens her mouth, closes it, opens it again. She starts, but it's useless. The truth is already laid bare. Mr. Reynolds exhales slowly, shaking his head. "You didn't check. You didn't scan her ID. You didn't even type in her name." His voice is low and even, but it cuts sharper than a knife. "You saw a young black woman in first class and made a decision. That's what happened, isn't it?" Heather's face burns red. Her hands tremble slightly, and for the first time since this started, she looks truly afraid. Heather's face drains of color so quickly it's as if all the blood has been sucked from her body. Her once smug, confident expression crumbles into something dangerously close to panic. Her lips part, but no sound comes out. Jasmine watches her, standing tall, her hands trembling slightly, but her voice steady as steel. "Yes," she says, her words cutting through the stunned silence of the terminal. "And now my ID is in pieces." A man in line, a businessman in a pressed suit who had been trying to mind his own business, lets out a low whistle. "That's messed up," he mutters, shaking his head. Heather visibly flinches at his words, as if finally realizing just how many people are watching, how many have been standing here bearing witness to everything. The crowd has grown, a dozen phones lifted, capturing every second of this escalating disaster. Her fingers twitch, as if she's considering reaching for the torn ID, as if she could somehow undo what she's done. She starts, but the words falter. Jasmine doesn't let her off the hook. "Say it," she demands, her voice sharp, unwavering. "Say that you didn't check. Say that you didn't scan it. Say that you just assumed I wasn't supposed to be here." Heather swallows hard. Her once rock-solid stance is crumbling beneath the weight of the truth. She tries again, but then she snaps. "How was I supposed to know?" Heather blurts, her voice laced with desperation, with crumbling defenses. "Do you have any idea how many people come through here flashing fake credentials trying to sneak into first class? I was just doing my job." The businessman scoffs loudly. "Your job is to rip up people's IDs without checking the system? You sound like a damn TSA nightmare." A few people laugh sharply, but the moment is too tense for humor to truly land. Jasmine's jaw tightens, her stomach burning with a fire she refuses to suppress. "You weren't doing your job," she spits. "You were making sure someone like me didn't get the chance to belong." Heather visibly recoils, like the words have physically struck her. "That's not—" Mr. Reynolds steps forward, cutting her off. "Enough." His voice is calm, but the kind of calm that carries real authority, the kind of calm that signals the end of someone's career. Heather turns to him, eyes wild, searching for an escape route. "Mr. Reynolds, You were just making a massive mistake," he says coldly, "one that this airport and this airline will not be ignoring." Heather freezes. Jasmine's heart slams against her ribs, but she forces herself to breathe through it, to stay composed, to stay in control. Mr. Reynolds exhales, shaking his head. "Miss Carter, I sincerely apologize on behalf of this airport and our staff. This should never have happened." He gestures toward the torn ID, then at Heather. "And it will be addressed." Jasmine meets his gaze, searching for any sign of insincerity. She finds none. Heather, on the other hand, is now visibly trembling. Her hands ball into fists at her sides, her breaths shallow, her perfect bun slightly unraveling from the sheer stress of it all. For the first time, she looks like she truly understands what she's done. Heather stammers, her mouth opening and closing as if she's grasping for the right words, but none seem to come. I didn't know," she finally manages, her voice unsteady, cracking under the weight of what she's just realized. "I thought I was just following protocol. Mr. Reynolds doesn't let her finish. His normally composed expression is gone, replaced by something sharper, something laced with disgust and restrained fury. His voice is low but lethal as he takes a step closer, his eyes locked onto Heather like a predator delivering the final blow. "You didn't follow protocol," he snaps, each word clipped, precise, as if spelling out her failure so she has no choice but to confront it. "You didn't verify, you didn't scan her ID, you didn't even type her name into the system. Instead, you humiliated a VIP passenger, one with a legitimate, paid, first-class ticket, based on nothing but your own assumptions." Heather's breath hitches. She catches her breath, panic coiling around her throat like a noose. "You ripped up her ID," Mr. Reynolds continues, his voice cutting through every desperate excuse she tries to form. "You physically destroyed government-issued identification. That alone is a serious violation." Heather, it blushes her eyes, darting toward the two uniformed security officers still standing nearby. She realizes what this means. She inhales sharply, shaking her head again, as if trying to deny the reality closing in around her. "I thought I was doing the right thing. It didn't look real." Jasmine lets out a sharp breath, disbelief flashing across her face. "Even now," she says, voice laced with exhaustion and anger, "you still won't just admit that you saw me, saw my skin, saw my last name, and made a decision." Heather's mouth presses into a thin, wide line. Jasmine doesn't let up. You didn't second-guess it. Didn't stop to think maybe I was telling the truth. You just decided I didn't belong, and now, instead of owning that, you're standing here fumbling for excuses. Heather flinches at that, her jaw tightening. Miss Carter is correct, Mr. Reynolds states. His voice final, cutting off any last-ditch attempts Heather might have had to talk her way out of this. He turns to the security officers, nodding once. Escort her out. Heather's eyes widen in horror. Wait, what? One of the officers steps forward, his voice neutral but firm. Heather Collins, you need to step away from the counter and come with us. Heather whips around to Mr. Reynolds, panic fully setting in now. Sir, please, it was a mistake. I can fix this. Mr. Reynolds' expression is unmoved. You already did this. Now you'll deal with the consequences. Heather's throat bobs, her whole body rigid with fear. She looks around, wildly scanning the faces of the crowd, the cameras still recording, the onlookers watching her downfall unfold in real time. For the first time since this began, Jasmine sees real fear in her eyes, but it doesn't move her. Heather brought this on herself. Heather's hands tremble as she takes a half step back, her throat tightening as the security officers close in. Wait, just wait, she pleads, her voice desperate, cracking at the edges. Mr. Reynolds, please, Look, I made a mistake, but it wasn't malicious. I was just being careful. Jasmine watches her, her stomach twisting, not in sympathy, but in frustration, in the sheer audacity of it all. Even now, Heather refuses to just admit it. Heather shakes her head wildly, her perfect composure fully shattered. You don't understand what it's like working here. We're always being told to watch for suspicious behavior, to racially profile people. Jasmine cuts in, her voice sharper than a blade. Heather fletchens. Mr. Reynolds exhales, looking at Heather like she's something to be scraped off the bottom of his shoe. You are in no position to try and justify this, he states flatly. Heather's eyes dart to Jasmine, desperate now. I didn't mean to. You did mean to, Jasmine interrupts, refusing to let her rewrite the narrative. You looked at me and decided I didn't belong before I even opened my mouth. That was your call, your decision. Heather's lips part, but she doesn't deny it. The security officers step in closer. Ma'am, we need you to come with us. Heather's breath hitched. Jasmine steps forward, her voice clear, unwavering. Before she leaves, I want to file an official complaint against her. I want this documented. Heather's head snaps toward Jasmine, her face a mixture of anger and disbelief. Mr. Reynolds nods without hesitation. Absolutely. He turns to one of the officers. Escort her to HR first. I want this on record immediately. Heather stiffens. Yes, Mr. Reynolds confirms, his expression unreadable. As of now, you are suspended indefinitely pending an investigation. Heather physically recoils as if the words strike her. Her breath catches, her eyes widening as the realization truly sinks in. Wait, suspended? Mr. Reynolds folds his arms. We take racial discrimination very seriously. Heather looks like she's about to be sick. I can explain. You've explained enough. The officers take her by the arms, guiding her away from the counter. Jasmine watches her go, her heart pounding, her hands still shaking. The weight of the moment presses down on her, but she refuses to buckle. Heather looks back just before she disappears from view, her face ashen, terrified. For the first time since this started, she looks like she finally understands what it feels like to be powerless. Jasmine walks through the terminal in a daze, her pulse still thrumming in her ears. The faces of strangers blur together as she moves, some staring at her in recognition, others avoiding her gaze entirely. The torn pieces of her ID still flash in her mind, Heather's smug smirk turning to panic, the way her voice cracked when she realized what she had done. She exhales sharply, forcing herself to keep moving. She won. That should be enough. But it doesn't feel like a victory, it feels heavy, exhausting. She finally reaches the gate, where a new flight attendant, a young black woman with soft curls and a warm smile, scans her ticket. "Welcome aboard, Miss Carter," she says, her voice gentle, as if she already knows what Jasmine has been through. Jasmine nods in thanks, stepping onto the jet bridge, forcing herself to push forward. When she enters the first-class cabin, she barely notices the plush seats or the calming ambiance. She just finds her seat by the window, lowers herself into it, and lets out a long breath. She closes her eyes for a moment, pressing her fingertips to her temples. She feels the exhaustion creeping in, the weight of every moment she spent fighting just to be seen. A voice pulls her out of it. "Rough day?" She opens her eyes and turns to see the man seated next to her. Mid-40s, salt and pepper hair, expensive but understated suit. There's something calm about him, something perceptive. He isn't just making idle conversation. He's really looking at her, picking up on her energy. Jasmine lets out a hollow laugh. You could say that. The plane hums as passengers continue to board, flight attendants moving down the aisles with practiced efficiency. Jasmine isn't sure why, but she speaks before she can stop herself. "I was just accused of using a fake ID," she says, her voice flat. Then it was ripped in half, right in front of me. Marcus raises a brow. "And let me guess, you weren't given the benefit of the doubt?" Jasmine shakes her head, looking out the window. "Not even for a second." Marcus exhales through his nose. "People like us never are." Jasmine turns back to him, curiosity flickering behind her exhaustion. "You say that like you know from experience." Marcus smiles, but there's no humor in it. "Oh, I do." She studies him for a moment. There's something in his eyes. A quiet understanding, a familiarity with what it feels like to be dismissed before being heard. The plane's engines roar to life and Jasmine leans back against her seat, grateful for the first moment of stillness she's had all day. She knows this isn't over. The complaint, the investigation, the fallout, it will all follow her. But for now, she allows herself to breathe. Jasmine wakes up to the soft chime of her phone vibrating on the nightstand beside her. The flight had been uneventful after she landed in New York, but the exhaustion had clung to her like a second skin. She had barely made it to her hotel room before collapsing into sleep, hoping for a few hours of peace before the storm she knew was coming. But now, as she blinks against the morning light filtering through the curtains, her stomach twists when she sees the name flashing across the screen. She hesitates, fingers hovering over the screen before finally swiping to answer. "Hey, David Carter's voice is calm but cold, the way it always is when he's furious but holding it back. "Jasmine, I just got off the phone with the airport director." Jasmine sits up instantly. "I saw the footage," he continues, his voice clipped. "I saw the report, the emails, the photos of your ID." He stops himself, exhales through his nose. "The way that woman treated you was unacceptable, and I'm making sure it never happens again." Jasmine swallows, pulling the blanket around herself, feeling suddenly exposed. "I didn't want to call you right away," she admits. "I wanted to handle it myself." "You did handle it," her father says. "But this isn't just about you anymore. It's about every black passenger who walks into that airport and gets treated like they don't belong. It's about every person of color who has to deal with this kind of unchecked bias." Jasmine's throat tightens. She had spent so much time just trying to survive the moment, trying to stand her ground, that she hadn't let herself fully consider the bigger picture. "I already spoke with the airline," David continues. "Heather Collins has been fired, effective immediately." Jasmine closes her eyes, letting the weight of those words settle over her. Fired, not suspended, not reassigned, gone. "She had a record of complaints," her father adds. "Yours was just the final straw." Jasmine exhales, rubbing a hand over her face. "Good," she murmurs, and she means it. But David isn't done. "This isn't over. I've already set up a meeting with the airport's executive board. We're going to rewrite their training protocols from the ground up. This will not happen again. Not to you, not to anyone else." Jasmine leans back against the headboard, gripping her phone tighter. Her father has always been a force of nature, a man who doesn't just respond to injustice, he dismantles it. And now, Heather Collins isn't just out of a job, She's about to become the reason the entire system changes. Jasmine stares at the ceiling, her father's words still ringing in her ears. This will not happen again. He's handling it the way he always does, with power, precision, and unshakable determination. But Jasmine knows this is bigger than just one conversation in a boardroom. Heather Collins being fired is justice, but it's not change. Not yet. She throws off the blankets, sits up, and reaches for her laptop. If she's going to be a part of this fight, she needs to be prepared. She starts researching, digging into case studies, reading about implicit bias in the airline industry, finding articles on racial discrimination in customer service. And the more she reads, the angrier she gets. It's everywhere. Black travelers being questioned more aggressively at airport security, black passengers being removed from first class for looking suspicious, flight attendants assuming black customers don't belong in premium seating. It's a pattern, a system that's been in place for decades. Her hands tighten into fists as she clicks through another report. She knows what she has to do. Her father is already handling the corporate side of things, but Jasmine wants to go deeper. She wants to make sure this isn't just some surface-level policy shift that companies use as a PR stunt. She reaches for her phone and starts making calls. First to a professor at her university who specializes in racial bias in business, then to a journalist she knows who covers discrimination cases. Finally, to a civil rights lawyer who has spent years working on cases like this. Within hours, she has a plan, one that involves real accountability, real action, and real voices speaking out. She's not just going to be a victim of this story. She's going to rewrite it. Jasmine's phone won't stop buzzing. Emails, calls, messages from people she hasn't spoken to in years. The story has exploded. News outlets are covering it, civil rights organizations are weighing in, and social media is flooded with clips of Heather tearing up her ID. But what shocks her most is the response from other airlines. At first, it's just Carter Airlines leading the charge, her father making good on his promise, implementing mandatory racial bias training for all employees, from flight attendants to upper management. But soon, other major airlines start following suit. A press release from one company announces a zero-tolerance policy for racial discrimination. Another airline launches an internal audit on how their staff interacts with passengers of color. Some companies go even further, rolling out new diversity initiatives to prevent incidents like Jasmine's from ever happening again. And then, something even bigger happens. A former flight attendant from a different airline comes forward sharing her own experience of being pressured to profile black passengers as high risk. A retired pilot writes an op-ed about the bias he saw in first-class seating assignments. A floodgate has been opened and the truth is pouring out. Jasmine watches it all unfold, sitting at her desk with her laptop glowing in the dim light. This isn't just about her anymore. What started as one humiliating moment at an airport counter has turned into a nationwide conversation. Her hands tremble slightly as she scrolls through an email, this one from a senator's office, requesting a meeting to discuss new federal guidelines for anti-bias training in the aviation industry. Jasmine exhales, pressing a hand to her forehead. This is real? She never wanted to be in this position. But now that she is, she's going to make damn sure it counts. Jasmine stands in the lobby of Carter Airlines headquarters, her gaze locked on the massive portrait of her grandfather hanging on the far wall. The image is bold, commanding, a black man in a sharp suit standing proudly beside the first aircraft the company ever owned. His arms are crossed, his expression one of determination and quiet defiance. The kind of look that says, "I built this, I belong here, and no one will tell me otherwise." She takes a slow breath, letting the weight of the moment settle over her. A few weeks ago, she had walked into an airport as just another passenger, excited for her trip, expecting nothing more than a smooth flight. She had left that airport a fighter, a voice, a catalyst for change. She never asked for this battle. But standing here now, surrounded by the legacy her family built, she realizes this is where she was always meant to be. Her father's voice echoes in her head. This will not happen again. She smiles softly. It won't, because she's going to make damn sure of it. Have you ever witnessed racial bias firsthand? How would you have handled this situation? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Let's talk about it. Discrimination is still alive today, but so is the fight for justice. Jasmine's story is just one of many, but it's proof that speaking up makes a difference. No one should have to fight for the right to be treated with respect, but when injustice happens, silence is not an option. Never let anyone tell you where you don't belong. Whether it's in a classroom, a boardroom, or a first-class seat, you deserve to be seen, heard, and valued. Your voice matters. Your story matters. Real change starts when we hold people accountable and refuse to accept the status quo. We are stronger together. What would you have done in Jasmine's shoes? What needs to change in the airline industry and beyond? Let's start the conversation. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more inspiring stories of courage and change. Every voice matters, and together we can shine a light on injustice and push for a better future. Change starts with awareness, it grows with conversation, and it becomes unstoppable when we take action. Let's create a world where everyone's dignity is recognized and respected. No exceptions, no excuses. Share this story. Start the conversation. Be the change.